Welcome to this exclusive Portfolio Construction Forum presentation, recorded in Auckland on the 20th of May as part of Portfolio Construction Forum Symposium New Zealand 2014. Capitalism, bruised but still champion, with Dr. Oliver Hartwich, Executive Director, the New Zealand Initiative, Wellington.
When I first spoke to you, I spoke about the shift of the global economy from the west to the east, from the north to the south. That was 2 years ago, and I had a big PowerPoint presentation. And I spoke to you again last year, and I had a big prepared speech about New Zealand domestic policy challenges. Today I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, I don't have a big prepared speech, I just have a few speaking notes. And the reason is that today the speech is really from the heart. It's really trying to tell you what my deep-held beliefs are about capitalism, the free market, how to run an economy, and I think all the things that we've learned in the past decades. So today we've called this session Capitalism, bruised but still champion. And I think that actually characterizes capitalism today quite well, because capitalism has had quite a bad press over the last few years, certainly since the GFC, certainly since the collapse of Lehman Brothers. But actually, the bad press for capitalism precedes even the global financial crisis. I think over the last 10 or 15 years, the public, certainly public intellectuals in a lot of Western developed countries, have become increasingly hostile towards the idea of a free market of capitalism. And it started in the late 1990s. Remember the protests against the G7 meetings and the G20 meetings. Remember that there was a movement called Attack Against Globalization. There was Naomi Klein's book, No Logo. And that really tried to make the case that globalization doesn't work and that it's somehow unfair and it leads to inequality and all sorts of ills. And there were documentaries made about this and some even won Oscars. But then, of course, the GFC happened and the whole anti-capitalism mood became even more fierce. And now we have the Occupy Wall Street movement that's still going. We have a new book written by a French economist called Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, which is really an indictment of capitalism, saying that capitalism does not really lift anyone out of poverty. It makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. We've all heard this before, but now you can read it in 600 pages. So capitalism has had a bad press. I think what's also contributed to this perception that capitalism does not quite work the way we hoped it would is also the rise of China. Because capitalism for the last 20 years, in the beginning it looked almost unchallengeable. It was the only game in town after the demise of communism. But suddenly China appears, and a lot of intellectuals point at China and say, well, actually, this is not really capitalism because it is still quite a guided, planned economy. So maybe that's our model, more this authoritarian model. So maybe capitalism doesn't quite work. Well, I've come here today to really defend capitalism, to defend the free market. And actually, to be honest, I don't even like the word capitalism. Capitalism sounds like an ideology, like fascism or socialism, anything with an ism at the end. I don't think capitalism is like that. It is not an ideology. It's just something that happens naturally when you let people deal with their own affairs. I don't like capitalism, the word, for another reason, because it sounds too much like, well, if you try to figure out what does a capitalist look like, you think of someone in a three-piece suit with a monocle and smoking cigars. To me, that's not what capitalism is about. Capitalism is about people making their own decisions, making their own choices based on their own preferences, dealing with one another. So to me, that's not capitalism, that's more like a market economy, a free market economy. And just to make this very clear, it is not a market society necessarily, because even in a free market economy, there would always be some things that are not decided in the market that are decided by other institutions. There would still be families, there would be clubs, there would be charities, there would be trusts, there would still be civil society, but some things will, of course, be dealt with in the marketplace. So capitalism, bruised but still champion, if I had my way, I would probably call it the market economy. Now, how did I come to my conviction? Well, it's a very personal story. As Graham mentioned, and as you probably hear, I'm German. I grew up in West Germany, and I visited Berlin a few times. The first time I visited Berlin was in 1988. I don't know whether any one of you has been to communist countries, or did anyone actually visit East Berlin? You probably all remember how it looked like. I visited just about a year before the wall collapsed. And I came from West Germany, and West Germany was really like New Zealand or Australia or Britain, it was a market economy. It was capitalist, if you like. It was colorful. It was quite exciting. We drove different cars. The cars had different colors. We had choice of products. We could get all sorts of citrus fruit in the supermarkets. Even when they were not in season, we could get all sorts of things. It was really a capitalist consumer paradise. And then crossing that border to East Berlin and spending just a day in the capital of East Germany, it was such a mind-blowing, sobering experience. Not only that you constantly felt under surveillance, but everything, to sum it up in one word, was gray, or beige rather. It was really not an appealing place. It was a weird place. Just to share a few anecdotes with you. You know, when you go to a supermarket and you buy whole chicken, how does it look in a capitalist society? Beautifully packaged like that. In East Berlin, I saw chicken that were like that, deep frozen. You had to cut the slices of the loaves of bread in the supermarkets if you could find them. There was hardly anything really worth buying. The shelves were empty. It was depressing. And the prices were strange. The prices were really strange. You know, when you go to a supermarket in New Zealand, you get all sorts of things, $1.99, $2.99. In East Berlin, the prices were 67 pfennigs or 83 pfennigs or whatever for a museum ticket or for a slice of bread or whatever it might be, because that was not a market price, not a price to entice anyone to buy stuff, but that's what the planners had decided. So that was a very depressing story, and of course, traveling back from East Berlin, of course, you got searched. They wanted to check that you had no one hidden in your boot, because, of course, people wanted to get out. That's why they had the Berlin Wall in the first place. And then I visited Berlin 2 years later in 1990, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Germany was in the process of reunification, and you could feel this buzz. So suddenly, this capitalist wave had swept over the East, and actually things were happening. And I visited again in 1992, and it was unbelievable, the change. Suddenly everything was colorful. Suddenly the supermarket shelves were stocked. It was just a completely different country, and it just was what happens when you let people freely deal with one another. So there was a lot of optimism around that time. And if you remember, there was an American social scientist, a political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, who even proclaimed at the end of all of this that really this was the end of history. That was definitive proof that capitalism had won, that the liberal democracy model has won, and that was the end of story, the end of history, and that's what he called his book. Well, 10 years later, almost 10 years later, I attended a conference where Francis Fukuyama spoke. It was just after 9/11, and the question to Fukuyama was whether history had restarted now that there was a new threat, radical Islam. But the great irony, of course, was that history never really finished. So it didn't have to restart. Because if you think back to the time when Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history, that was a time when Google had not even been founded. And mobile phones were the size of bricks. And when you talked about tweeting, you had birds in mind, right? So history never stopped. History is an ongoing process. And to declare one social system, one economic system, one political system, the winner of history is just ahistoric, because history never comes to this full stop. And I'm mentioning all of this because I just want to convey one message, that you can never declare a political or an economic system a winner once and for all. You have to fight ongoingly for your ideas. You have to constantly try to win this battle of ideas. And the whole battle of ideas business is really a business of boom and busts. So after 1945, a lot of countries went onto the path of a planned economy. Look at what happened in Britain at the time. Look at Clement Attlee. They instituted the welfare state. They started the town and country planning system. They started the NHS because they thought that a planned economy was the way forward. And Keynesian ideas were widespread. Now that Keynesian consensus then fell apart in the 1970s. In the 1980s, of course, we had radical reforms. You, of course, know what happened in New Zealand back then. But it also happened in America under Ronald Reagan. It happened in Britain under Margaret Thatcher. So that was the time when free market ideas got hold and when they became more prominent. But I think after the GFC, the pendulum has swung back again. And now we have these neo-Keynesian ideas, and people are starting to feel very uncomfortable about the idea of a free market again. So for economic liberals like myself, these are quite challenging times. And I'm still convinced that we've got a very good case to make for capitalism. But as I said, the zeitgeist is against us. And a lot of the principles and beliefs that we once held and that were once widespread about the free market economy, capitalism, if you want to, they are now being questioned. Things like free trade. That was something that we took for granted and that we thought was a good idea, the Washington Consensus, that free trade, once it's spread, actually contributes to the development of the global economy. But you look at the discussions around the Pacific Partnership, and you can see that there's a lot of uneasiness about that. We once believed that independent central banks were a good thing, and that should only be focused on price stability. Well, you look at monetary policy discussions these days, and you see what's coming out not only out of the Labour Party, and you see that that consensus is no longer really there. Now central banks are tasked with all sorts of things, saving the euro, bailing out Greece, or even fixing the Kiwi dollar's exchange rate. So privatization, deregulation, another factor, I think, where we had a lot of agreement previously, but it's now been undermined. But despite all of these discussions, I really believe that free market economists, liberals, still have the better arguments. And I still think you can make a very good case for the free market economy. There are empirical arguments. Well, first of all, capitalism is the greatest wealth creation machine that we know. To just give you one example, Sweden in the 19th century was poorer than Congo is today. And Sweden, okay, you may say Sweden is now this semi-socialist paradise, but actually it became rich at a time when it was very close to free market ideals in the earlier part of the 20th century. That's the effect of capitalism. We can also look globally how life expectancy has improved, basically across the world, but particularly in those countries following a free market model. The places in the world where you still see life expectancy significantly behind the others is Africa, but Africa is not really, in large parts, a free market model. Life expectancy has improved dramatically in Asian countries, precisely because Asian countries opted to go for more capitalism. You can see this on a global scale when you look at poverty reduction. The Brookings Institution last year produced a report, and they predicted that by next year, global poverty would have fallen to 585 million people. That's people living on just $1.25 a day. Well, that's still too many people, of course, and we should drive this down further. However, in 2005, the figure was still 1.3 billion people. So we've actually reduced poverty, global poverty, by hundreds of millions of people just by taking them into a market economy, by letting them get decent jobs and become more productive. We can also see this in the reduction of preventable diseases, because once a country gets wealthier, it can afford to offer its citizens better protection. So we have eradicated some diseases, and if you look at the vaccinations, for example, you can now see that more than 3/4 of the population in developing countries are vaccinated, for example, against measles. You can see it in mobile phone subscriptions worldwide. They are on the way up, and even in the poorest countries now, more than half the population regularly has access to mobile phones. It is all very well for Western intellectuals to belittle capitalism. You know, your soy decaf latte drinking intellectuals saying, oh, it's just materialism. But actually, for a lot of people, it is not just the access to soy decaf lattes. It is actually something more fundamental. In 1985, for example, in China, only 7% of the Chinese urban population had a fridge. Today, it is more than 90%. And by the way, back then, the rural population was only 0.1% with a fridge. Today, it's 25%. So there are improvements in the lives, in the daily lives of people brought about by a greater access to capitalist institutions. Think about it this way. If the richest man of the 18th century, Louis XIV, would visit Bill Gates today, or Carlos Slim, or one of the multi-billionaires, what would Louis XIV be impressed by? He would be impressed that Bill Gates has access to running water, to hot water, that he could watch the news on TV, that he could email people in an instant, and that he could read all sorts of newspapers on his tablet. Well, but then you would tell Louis XIV that actually it's not just Bill Gates, it's practically all of us who have that access. So capitalism has really democratized wealth. It has actually brought incredible riches, unimaginable to people in previous times, to ordinary people in countries around the globe. And I think that's quite something to be proud of if you're a capitalist. I think we can also make very good empirical cases for capitalism. Just compare, as I just did, Germany, East Germany compared to West Germany, or North Korea to South Korea. You can see where capitalism works, and you can see where socialism fails. You can look at empirical studies of economic freedom, and a number of think tanks around the world are doing that. And they measure that capitalism, wherever it's tried, usually correlates with higher life expectancy, better health results, a more democratic society, a freer press. There is an overwhelming empirical case also that more free societies also generate more growth. You can also look at long-time studies of economic progress, and I think the best one was done a few years ago by the late Angus Maddison, a British economist who tracked economic growth really from Roman times until the present day. And until about the 1700s, there's hardly any movement. GDP per capita worldwide was under $1,000 in today's money. But then it suddenly spiked and goes up like a hockey stick. And the reason behind all of this is really the discovery of Enlightenment principles, the discovery of economic principles, the takeoff of capitalism from a mercantilist society before. So capitalism has really worked. I think we can also make a moral case for capitalism. Capitalism is probably the only system that doesn't require us to invent a new man, not a socialist man, not an Aryan race, not a religious cult of devotees. It just takes us as we are, as self-interested individuals, and it transforms that into the greater good for society. I said self-interested, not selfish, because you can still be altruist, and you can still deal in clubs and charities and neighborhood associations. But it takes you where you are, it takes you at your self-interest, and it converts that into something that's good for society. And that's the famous quote from Adam Smith. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. That's how capitalism works. It takes us as we are. It takes us with all our desires, with all our abilities, and it converts it into something that works for the greater good. So capitalism, I would argue, is a system of freedom and dignity. And just as an aside, the opposite of freedom is not justice. The opposite of freedom is coercion. I think this is something that especially the political left often gets wrong when they argue against capitalism and promise against this a more just society. I think the only opposite of freedom really is coercion. So we can make a very good empirical case for capitalism. We can make a moral case for capitalism. I think we can also make a very good theoretical case for capitalism. And I'm an economist, and we economists, we study this in our undergraduates. And the basic principles of a market economy are extremely well established. You do not need a PhD in economics to understand how a market economy works. And you would struggle to find an economist contradicting any of the propositions that I'm going to explain to you now. So, for example, free trade benefits everybody involved. That's something that's been well established since Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the theory of comparative advantage. Basically, anyone in a transaction dealing voluntarily with another person gains. Economics is not a zero-sum game. We all benefit. We benefit when we deal internationally. We benefit when we deal domestically. We create wealth every time we voluntarily enter into a contract. And that's what capitalism does. We know the importance of secure property rights. We know the importance of freedom of contract. Of course, it doesn't mean that just because we understand it, we would actually follow this principle. Just think of trying to build a house in New Zealand under the IMA. So you might have property rights for some piece of land, but you can't just build what you want. But at least in principle, in theory, we understand how important it is to have secure property rights and freedom of contract. We know how important competition is as a disciplining force for people in the market. We know how important it is to generate information, to really bring people together in the marketplace. We know that it's also a tool to make sure that nobody gets too powerful, because you always have somebody else trying to compete against this market player. We know that inflation is an evil and that monetary policy should strive to really create a stable monetary system. We know how incentives matter, and yet we don't quite follow this. Look at the welfare state, how it's constructed, how it rewards people for actually taking time off rather than working. We know that government is often a necessary evil, and I wouldn't want to do without government completely, but it is a necessary evil. It is very seldom a force for real good. And we know that the price mechanism is a wonderful information tool. Without the price mechanism, nothing would work, and yet that's exactly why socialism failed, because they didn't have one. They relied on planning instead. There's a very good debate in the 1920s between famous Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises and some socialist economists arguing that, look, you could probably make socialism work. Mises, an ultra-libertarian, argued, but you don't have prices, and that's why it won't work, because you cannot really tell how much something is worth unless you've got people freely bidding for it. So economics, the way I see it, is about little more than these core principles. They are well established. They are tried and tested. We have a good empirical case for them. We have a good theoretical case for them. We have a good moral case for capitalism. The only people arguing against capitalism, I think, are politicians and self-interested groups. But that shouldn't stop us from making the case for capitalism.
Thank you for listening. For more information about Portfolio Construction Forum, Symposium New Zealand and Symposium New Zealand 2014 Resources Kit, please visit portfolioconstruction.co.nz.